Welcome to Minding Men. My name is Brian Pollack, and we are talking today about men and ADHD. Our guest is Dr. Roberto Olivardia, MD, and he's a clinical psychologist, lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and clinical associate at McLean Hospital. He maintains a private psychotherapy practice in Lexington, Massachusetts, where he specializes in the treatment of ADHD, executive functioning issues, and issues that face students with learning differences. He also specializes in the treatment of body dysmorphic disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, and he's published research and clinical work in the field of eating disorders and body image issues in boys and men that spans nearly 30 years. He's co-author of the book, The Adonis Complex, which details the various manifestations of body image problems in men and males, and currently serves as the professional advisory board for child and adults and ADHD at CHAD and the Attention Deficit Disorder Association. He also sits on the scientific advisory board for ADDitude or Attitude magazine and is a featured expert for Understood. Dr. Olivardia, what a bio.
I'm busy.
How are you?
I'm doing great. You know, it's summertime, Brian, and that's, for me, that's my jam. I'm a summer guy. I mean, I love Boston. I would never move from Boston, but you know, I'm not a big fan of the wintertime. So in the summertime, every day is a good day.
I'm glad to hear it. It is summertime right now. Thank goodness. I agree. And one of the reasons I brought you on here is because we talk so much in the world of mental health about understanding mood and emotion regulation and, you know, underlying diagnoses per se. But something that I think people get very, very confused about is ADHD and learning differences and what that really is. So I thought what we would do today is maybe just start a little bit about you and your journey as a professional, what got you interested into this work, and what's inspired you along the way.
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much I can say to that. I mean, so first of all, I have ADHD. So I come from this as a professional. I come from this as a parent of two teenagers with ADHD and as someone with a lived experience of ADHD. And I agree with you. I mean, this ADHD is one of the most, for something that is as common as it is so misunderstood. And from the mental health field, I think vastly clinically underappreciated in terms of the impact that it can have on an individual, as well as individuals who have ADHD with any kind of comorbid or associated disorder. But from my experience, ever since I was a young kid, I was always curious about people, always interested in what made people do the things they did, say the things they said. Just loved watching people. I had no problem entertaining myself, just people watching, and come from a family where helping other people was a very, very large value of mine. You know, my parents would say, just, you want to be a positive force in the world, always look to elevate people, don't ever be somebody who brings people down. And both of my parents were incredibly empathic, very helpful to other people, particularly my mom, who had the privileges that I had, that my parents afforded me, would have absolutely been a social worker, psychologist, therapist. She just had that way about people. So in some ways, I say it's kind of in the DNA, and definitely both in the nature and the nurture. And so for me, my own experience was I pretty much hated school through most of my life. That's an understatement. Sounds dramatic, but I really, really disliked school. Thankfully, I had friends, and that's what got me through, was sort of, you know, having really good friends who were really funny, and humor goes a long way with me. And I thought, this is just irrelevant and boring. And I'm the youngest of three, you know, immigrant parents, where college was really important. They wanted, of course, to give their kids opportunities, and I horrified my parents one day by saying, I'm not doing this college thing. Like literally, you're going to waste your money for me to get into a lot of trouble. And so I love music. I have lots of passions. Music is absolutely one of them. And I can bang the drum decently. And I thought, I knew someone who was starting a punk band and moving to Los Angeles. So I'm like, I'll just play drums in that band. And I was dead serious. And to their, relief, my senior year of high school, I took a psychology course, and that changed the trajectory of my life. It was the first time I was excited. I was present. I felt vital. Like I felt like, oh my gosh, like this is, and it didn't surprise me that I found the content interesting. It was more the academic nature of it. Like I couldn't wait to read more of the textbook, where I was always the person skimming, to do the least amount to sort of get by and get through. Then I went from that to, I'm going to go to college and major in psychology. And, I grew up in the Boston area. I went to Tufts University on undergrad. And within 2 weeks at Tufts, I looked at this book that told you all the different things you can do with a bachelor's, a master's, Ph.D, and M.D. And I thought, okay, well, I know I'd like to, do research. I'd like to work with people. I didn't want to prescribe medication. So an MD wasn't, so I'm like, okay, I guess I'll get a PhD. I mean, it was so matter of fact. And honestly, like getting a PhD was a much easier experience than graduating high school. Because I loved it. Like it was just, and as we'll, I'm sure, talk about today, I mean, for folks with ADHD, that need of really clicking into something is paramount. Like I can't do something that I don't enjoy doing. And it sounds almost self-centered to say that, but for parents who might be listening to this or educators, when you hear, of course, people don't want to be bored, but it's really painfully hard for someone with ADHD to execute and to sort of do things if they don't feel that kind of stimulation attached to it. And there are a lot of neurological and neurochemical reasons. I mean, this isn't just will, that we know that there's a whole science behind why that is.
Wow. So what a journey. I kind of wish I was a fly on the wall when you discovered psychology. It sounds like your whole world just shifted in transition.
Amazing. Yeah.
That's what we're after in life, is those moments. It's incredible. I want to go right to what your last point was, because your story is so pertinent to why you got into all of this. But there's so many people who listen, as well as people just looking for information as to that research and what people are trying to make sense of here. And I think ADHD has a really unfortunate stigma or misunderstanding. So if you don't mind, kind of what are some of the research components that we're finding out about people? Males, yes, I know many women, of course, and you could talk about women, of course, as well, and how they present. But what are you finding in the research that seems to right now be really intriguing and captivating?
Well, one of the things that's so important, and this is true, I mean, when I was not diagnosed with ADHD as a child, and part of that is in the 1970s. I mean, to be diagnosed with ADHD, you had to like burn your school down. I mean, like you had to have like
that oppositional component, right?
Exactly. It was the kids with oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder. Now, granted, some of those kids were my friends. Like, I mean, because they were on the mischievous side, and I was a very mischievous kid, and I was a bit impulsive. But I had good social skills, and I didn't have a conduct disorder. I liked mischief. I used to call them shenanigans. I remember when I learned that word in the third grade, I thought, oh, I love that word, like shenanigans. But I always drew the line at I'm not ever going to do something that hurts somebody's feelings or hurts people or is destructive, in that kind of way. And I did decently in school. Like I did not fail classes, but it was, again, getting by and behind the scenes. Okay, yes, maybe I would have gotten A's, but behind the scenes, it was procrastinating, waiting for the last minute. Chaos, basically like behind the scenes in that. So even nowadays, sometimes I'll hear from clinicians who will exclude ADHD just based upon, oh, well, this person goes to an Ivy League school, they can't have ADHD. And I'm thinking, oh, no. Like that's precisely how these people get sort of missed and under the radar. So what we know from neurological research, which is so validating to people with ADHD and so exciting to me, both as someone with ADHD and also as a professional. So in a nutshell, we have all these neurochemicals in our brain. One of them is dopamine. Dopamine is implicated in reward. Mm-hmm. And so if you have adequate levels of dopamine in your brain, you're sort of stimulated, you feel grounded, you feel kind of rewarded. So you're not seeking sort of more, you're kind of there. So what we know about an ADHD brain is that we basically have at baseline, like a deficit in dopamine. So I think of ADHD as I am oriented to my environment, to my world, by what is going to stimulate me all the time. I have a bored brain, basically. So now everything that's pleasurable is stimulating. Not everything that's stimulating is pleasurable. Danger, conflict, anxiety, drama, very stimulating. So a lot of times individuals are not meaning to get into those situations, but I look back and I got into some really crazy, dangerous situations, but my intention was not that. What I'm realizing now is I was just self-medicating this need of like, well, because I had many sayings as a kid, even now I have many sayings, but one of them was like, well, it'll at least be a story. I used to say for the shenanigans I would get into, it'll be a story, even though, yeah, I could have lost my life in that situation, but it'll be a story. But so we know we have this dopamine deficit, which means that we need a lot more to feel properly stimulated. And as a result, so when we think of hyperactivity, for example, hyperactivity really is a way that an individual is just seeking stimulation. Like they're actually seeking something that will ground them, which sounds almost paradoxical because they might, if you think of the boy who's running all over the place, but he's running all over the place because it's almost like his brain is desperate to find that pocket of that thing that's going to kind of ground, that person. But an inattentive type is those inattentive presentation tends to be less noticed and diagnosed, but it could be the person that isn't maybe running around, but in their head, there's a hyperactivity. Like in their head, they're daydreaming. Like I have a very, very vivid inner world, Brian, in imagination because of years of being in school where I'm like, I need to get out of here. And I would just retreat and I would write songs in my head, or I would have stories. And then I later actually write them and win creative writing festivals. And people be like, oh, how did you come up with this? I'm thinking, yeah, my history teacher bored the crap out of me. And so here's this great story that comes out of it. Another neurochemical is GABA. When we have appropriate levels of GABA, we're appropriately inhibited. People with ADHD have lower levels of GABA. So that accounts for this sort of impulsivity, because all it takes, as you know, is sometimes 5 seconds to make for a situation to go from one way to another. The kid that might be mad at their teacher and have an internal thought of like, oh, shut up, but doesn't say it because they have appropriate levels of GABA that not only inhibit that response, but enable them to connect to the frontal lobe, which is there are consequences if I say that. Kid with ADHD, there's a delay in that. So that's the kid that might say, shut up, and without any awareness in that moment of the consequences. And then, of course, quickly see what the consequences are. And then a large part of ADHD with that impulsivity is also issues of executive functions, which are basically all the cognitive processes that we need to get things done, to execute things. And this is where ADHD, particularly in adulthood, is so important for people to grasp how fundamental that is. We're talking about time management, organizing your thoughts, organizing your room physically, remembering things, prioritizing things, making decisions. This is adulting, basically. Yeah. So when we think about ADHD, I mean, this is what's so crazy. It wasn't until the mid-90s that ADHD in adulthood was even recognized. I mean, where did people think it went? It just goes away when you're 18. It's like, yep, passing in my ADHD card, don't have it anymore. That's not how it happens. In fact, that's where it can be very disabling. And ADHD is not a mental illness. It's not brain damage, or we do know that there are these neurological differences, but we call it a condition of neurodiversity, which means that if it's not treated and managed or understood, it can lead to really bad things for people. People with ADHD, we carry a higher risk of addiction, of any kind of addiction, not just drug and alcohol. It could be food, it could be sex, it could be porn, it could be gambling, it could be video games, you name it. But as I say, especially the young boys that I work with, my own kids, like if we like something, we run the risk of liking it too much. So we need to sort of regulate that. However, if we manage it, we treat it, we understand it, we accept it, it can actually be an asset. Like I credit all of the wonderful things and a lot of the successes in my life to this ADHD brain. And I credit the not so great, crazy things and dark things in my life to this ADHD brain. It just is. And so the goal is to educate, to understand, and most importantly, and you spoke to this, to not stigmatize and self-stigmatize. You are different, and I don't, that word different often in and of itself becomes stigmatized, but I could tell you, everybody I know with ADHD, everyone, they can tell you the moment or around the time that they knew they were different from other people. They were just wired a little bit differently. And I remember that moment for me was in first grade, where it was quiet reading time and everyone had to pick a book out of the milk crates, Miss Kelly's reading class, and they sat, and I think it was probably 15 minutes, but for me, it felt like an hour, and they would sit and read. And I remember getting a book, and I was like, this silence was like deafening to me. Like I like stuff, I like noise, I like music, and I'm thinking, are these kids, are they really reading? And I'm like observing, and they looked really into what they were doing. And I remember asking my classmate Craig, who was reading Harold and the Purple Crayon. And I said, were you really reading Harold and the Purple Crayon? He's like, yeah, we're supposed to be reading. And I was like, I couldn't even focus on like doing that. And also to know 50 to 60% of people with ADHD have learning disabilities like dyslexia, which both of my kids have. I think I probably had a mild dyslexia as well. But we want to teach these kids that different isn't defective. So it's with education and the proper strategies.
I think you've done a dissertation on this, is my guess. And it's fantastic stuff. You alluded to so many things. I really want to ask you about the idea of, before you say anything, because you have so much to share, strengths, because there is a strengths-based perspective here, particularly many people, and let's call it our normal socioeconomic climate around this stuff, that's not the right sociocultural climate, is about using what you might call a superpower of ADHD. But then there's also something we haven't fully discussed yet. You've alluded to it, but social. I find so many individuals with ADHD struggle with that more social processing, learning, because of that 5-second reactivity or the lack of stopping ourselves or understanding how to read a room. Can you speak to that at all?
Absolutely. So this is the thing with ADHD that's also important, which can lead to a lot of confusion, because you can have 10 people with ADHD in a room, and there are going to be things that all 10 of them will have in common. That, when I go every year, there's an ADHD conference. This year, it's actually going to be back in person. It'll be in Dallas, Texas. And it is literally like you almost feel like you're in this club, because it's professionals, it's educators, it's parents, it's people who have ADHD. It's a very interdisciplinary, it's wonderful conference through Chad. I recommend people checking it out. You will feel like you're with like your tribe. So there are these things that just everybody can relate to. And then there are these other aspects that it can manifest very, very differently. So for some people with ADHD, absolutely that social piece, because to have good social skills requires some level of executive function. You have to regulate your attention. That's an executive function. To hear, let's say you're talking, there's 3 people in a group, you have to pay attention to what everybody is saying. You have to have the right timing to be able to respond to something, the processing speed to respond to something, as somebody is, saying it. You have to regulate your emotions. Emotional regulation is now conceptualized as an executive function, which is, okay, maybe we're talking about, let's say, a political topic that I might feel really charged about, but I have to regulate my emotions to communicate what I want to without really being off-putting to people. If my goal is to really communicate with people, how do I regulate my emotions? How do I, read the room as you were saying? I mean, there's a lot, like we take for granted, I would say people who don't have ADHD or have very high executive functions can take for granted all of the sort of steps that are involved in a lot of these things. And then some kids, because they might have a hard time regulating themselves, that people with ADHD sometimes lack sort of certain boundaries or body space. And, to other people be like, oh my gosh, you're so like in my face. And for the person with ADHD, it could be like, I'm trying to connect with you, like make it more. So for some of these individuals, not just kids, I mean, with adults I work with, it's teaching those social skills. Now, and I would highly recommend for anyone, there's a wonderful book called Why Will No One Play With Me? And it's written by an ADHD coach named Caroline McGuire, who's a colleague of mine here in Massachusetts. And she took all of that knowledge and research, and it's not just about kids with ADHD. It really could be applied to any young person who has social issues, and really breaks it down in terms of all the executive functioning pieces. Now, at the same time, there's also people with ADHD, and I would consider myself one of these people, where the social skills was like my asset. Like that was the thing that actually was my greatest tool in a way to navigate, in that I can hyper focus. Because the other thing with ADHD, the attention deficit is a bit of a misnomer. It's not that we lack all attention. It's that if it's boring or not stimulating, the attention is like really low. If it's really interesting, then the attention is actually higher than someone without ADHD. We call it the hyper focus. So for me, social stuff, going back to the beginning of my journey, people are my hyper focus. Like I'm so intuitively interested and curious that I was like I could zoom right in. So I was the kid that was like the class clown that would, if there was like an opening and I could say a line and the whole class would like laugh, the world of stand-up comedians, of actors, of improv. I used to do in my PhD program, I was like, I loved it, but I didn't want to just be in student mode. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to take some improv comedy classes, which my classmates are like, where do you have the time to do that? But I was like, oh, sleep, who needs it? But which is, I wouldn't suggest for people to do, but people with ADHD, unfortunately, can sometimes see sleep as very disposable. But I love, and I got into this whole world of improv comedy, and I would say most of the people in that world were ADHD. I mean, because it's all about, being in the moment and kind of, and it's similar to, we think again about attention. Like a lot of people with ADHD, for example, you might find are in fields like EMTs, for example, which require, now someone might think, oh my gosh, in a crisis situation, how does someone executively process? But for folks with ADHD, sometimes when you have a certain level of that urgency and stimulation, it like things become very crystal clear. And improv comedy was a lot like that. So you can have, I love public speaking. I love doing these kinds of things. When you ask me to do this, I'm like, of course, like I'm going to have a conversation with, a nice person, and we're going to educate people out there. Like, what's better than that? Like the power of knowledge. And so I get so excited by that. So it can be, you can see it kind of on either end. But at the same time, that's not to say like I, had to learn. I talk in my natural way. I can talk super fast, very loud. When I started graduate school and, as in our training, like we have supervision and we see patients. And in my early years, we would audio tape sessions with patients and my supervisor would hear the audio and they would say, you're coming across very empathic, you're connecting, but you're talking really fast. And there's like an intensity to you. And they were very nice about it. And they were right. And they said, especially for patients that might be more depressed or more, that might be a bit overwhelming for them. And that was helpful. And so I even though I had good social skills on one end, I still had to learn to regulate at the other end, at the same time. And it's not about dimming it completely, but it's about, again, regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding those skills and learning those skills and understanding it's not about tending to per se immediately the anxiety, but more the executive functioning or understanding more of the nuances and dealing with whatever else might be underneath can be so helpful, because you can start looking at the therapeutic side of all of this and feel like you're sputtering out because you're so hyper fixated on one thing or seemingly can't unlock yourself from there because it's so interesting and captivating that it fuels you. But the rest of your life, you're like, what, I got no interest. So it's tough. And I have so many questions and yet so little time left. The best of your ability, if you were to be able to put support in place to empower folks with ADHD and even professionals to treat it, what would you put in place? We got 60 seconds.
So first and foremost is educate. Like really there's a lot of great knowledge, but also be aware of where you're getting that knowledge, because there's a lot of misinformation. We're in a world of misinformation about a lot of things. And ADHD is one of them on social media. So look at organizations like CHAD, ADA, the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, Understood, Attitude, as you mentioned. Like these are reputable, scientifically, empirically based sources to educate about ADHD. There's a wonderful YouTube channel called How to ADHD. This young woman, Jessica McCabe, who does these videos, and she curates her information from the professionals. Wonderful. So educate, because it starts with really having an understanding and a validation of oh, that's me. Like that person is explaining, and I'm not the only one. And if I'm not the only one, and there are strategies, that means I can now avail myself to those strategies. And so as students, it's getting the right accommodations, because with ADHD, it's really about kind of putting the right environmental supports in place, whether we're talking in school, in a career, at home, to be able, especially during the pandemic where people had to work from home. There was a lot of work I was doing with patients of how do we set up your space to make it as distraction free as possible. How do we find what is the right career for you? Because if you're going to be dysfunctional at careers A, B, and C, then why are we trying to put a square peg in a round hole here? Let's look at it, who are you in that perspective? And then also, because of that education, understanding how you're wired. And that means understanding, okay, if I have this kind of like an addictive personality, I have to be careful about certain things. As you know, one of the areas of work that I do is in eating disorders. And I see a lot of people with ADHD and bulimia, ADHD and binge eating disorder. And, for people to understand, they just have to be honest with themselves too, I have to watch this, be honest with ourselves when I'm like, oh, I'll do that later. When someone with ADHD says that could end up being the night before pulling an all-nighter, which I've been there, done that way too many times. So it's really being honest with ourselves and getting the right support, people who understand it as well, because unfortunately there are a lot of people that don't, that'll be like, why is that so difficult for you? And we don't need any of that negative narrative, because people with ADHD, unfortunately, from a very young age, already have that narrative going. I mean, they're already thinking, why is this so difficult for me? There's a lot of frustration with ADHD, but with the proper tools, the proper treatment, you can thrive and you can kind of be exactly where you want to be.
And eventually be professor at Harvard. So with that said, I cannot thank you enough for joining us here at Minding.
Oh, my pleasure.
You are amazing. I've seen you speak in person. You've trained some of my team. You are incredible. I am thankful for you. I know this is not the end of us having a discussion. And Definitely. For all of you listening and watching here on MLTV 21, thank you for your time and being entertained and informed by this incredible psychiatrist, Dr. Roberto Olivardia. Have a wonderful day. This is Minding Men.